On the 30th of May 1832, a gunshot was heard ringing out across the 13th arrondissement in Paris. A merchant who was going to market that morning ran towards where the gunshot had come from and discovered a young man writhing in agony on the ground, clearly shot by a duelling wound. The young man was taken to the local Cochin hospital, where he died in the arms of his brother the next day, uttering the words, "Don't cry for me, Alfred, I need all the courage I can muster to die at the age of 20. The young man's name was Évariste Galois. He was a well-known revolutionary at the time. Now, it's not quite clear what that duel that morning was about. Was it a fight between friends over a lover, or the establishment trying to get rid of this troublesome revolutionary? Or some have even speculated that Évariste Galois might have staged his own death in order to spark a new revolution in Paris. We'll never be too clear what that duel was about. But it wasn't, in fact, revolutionary politics for which Évariste Galois became famous, because a few years earlier, while still at school, Évariste Galois had solved one of the great unsolved problems of mathematics at the time, and he'd sent his solution to the French Academy, very excited about his discovery. But the French Academy couldn't understand a word of what he was writing about, partly because this is the way that he wrote most of his mathematics. Deeply frustrated, he kind of left mathematics behind and threw himself into revolutionary politics. In fact, the night before that duel, he realised this was probably his last chance to explain his great breakthroughs, and he spent the whole of the night writing away notes to try and explain the discovery that he'd made. And as the sun came up over the new day and he went out to meet his destiny, he left this pile of mathematics on his desk. Maybe the fact that he was up all night doing mathematics was the reason he was such a bad shot that morning. But the documents that Galois left behind, we now regard as one of the most important documents in the history of mathematics, because inside those documents was a new language that Galois was developing to try and understand one of the kind of great mysteries of science, which is the subject of symmetry. This language, called group theory, is in fact a language I use every day as a practicing mathematician. And this language, group theory, has allowed mathematicians to really understand this very slippery subject of symmetry. And the subject of symmetry and Galois' story and humanity's attempts to try and understand symmetry are at the heart of this book I wrote called Finding Moonshine. But I also wanted to give readers kind of insight into what it is a research mathematician actually does. I think people have an idea: chemist mixes chemicals together, biologist classifies animals, physicist smashes together particles in the Large Hadron Collider. But what is it a mathematician does? So, in fact, along with the historical story of our attempts to understand symmetry, I also tell a very personal story of a year in my working life, and the book's divided up into 12 chapters, one for each month of the year, trying to give people a little bit of a backstage pass into what it's like to be a research mathematician investigating the subject of symmetry. I think a lot of people think a research mathematician, what are they doing? Are they doing long division to a lot of decimal places? And surely a computer has put me out of a job by now. So the book is trying to explain that we do something slightly more interesting than that. Now, it's a diary in the year of my working life, so I decided I need to start the diary on an important date. So actually a very important date for a mathematician is their 40th birthday. I was actually out in Sinai on my 40th birthday in 40 degrees heat, slapping on factor 40 sun cream. 40 is very significant because there's such an awful myth that we mathematicians have done our best work by the age of 40, and that somehow it's a young person's game. Even our Fields Medals, which are our kind of version of the Nobel Prize, they're awarded to mathematicians under the age of 40. So I was going through a kind of existential crisis a little bit on that birthday, and thought this diary would be a good way to document that, no, mathematicians are still active and burning to make discoveries after the age of 40. So as I said, I was on Sinai enjoying the heat on my 40th birthday. So that's where the book starts. But actually, when I was younger, I didn't really want to be a mathematician at all. Unlike every Scalwar who was burning to be a mathematician. In fact, I didn't even really know that being a mathematician was a job. In fact, when I was growing up, what I wanted to be was a spy. This was partly fueled by my mother, who'd been in the Foreign Office, and she'd always kind of convinced me and my sister that she'd actually been a spy for the British government. And when she left the Foreign Office, they let her keep the black gun that was hidden somewhere in the house. So my sister and I used to kind of hunt the house trying to find this gun. And of course, never found it because it was a fictional gun. But it sort of fueled my idea, yeah, I want to travel the world being a spy. So when I went up to secondary school, I started learning all the languages that I could learn that my school was teaching, because I realised languages were going to be an important part of talking to your fellow spies across the world. So we did French, German. There was actually a Russian course being taught by the BBC, so I got my French teacher to help me with the Russian course. But I began to find these languages deeply frustrating. There were all these kind of strange spellings that you just had to learn, these irregular verbs, and I just found it very difficult. The Russian course was a complete disaster. I couldn't get past the word for hello, which has so many consonants and no vowels, and I think it was even the name of the course, so I couldn't even say hello or the name of the course. So I got very disillusioned with this dream to become a spy and learn languages. And it was about when I was 12 or 13 that my mathematics teacher at my school, in the middle of the class, said, "Du Sautoy, I want to see you after the class." I thought, oh dear, I'm in trouble. At the end of the class, he took me round the back of the maths block. I thought, oh gosh, I'm really in trouble now. And then he said, I think you should find out what mathematics is really about, because it isn't what we're doing in the classroom. It's not all this long division or sines and cosines. It's something much more interesting. And he recommended a few books to me that he thought would open up this magical world of mathematics. And I took this list of books back home, and my parents took me up to Oxford, which was my nearest big city, and we went to the bookshop there, and my dad tried to find the books, and I wandered up and down the science bookshelves, seeing undergraduates at the university sort of reading these books as if they were great novels, and when I looked in them, it just seemed to be sort of a complex bit of code that I couldn't understand at all. But I went home and started reading these books, and one of these books in particular really caught my fancy. It was called The Language of Mathematics. I still actually have the copy of the book we bought that weekend. It cost £1.25. I don't think you find a book for £1.25 anymore. But the book was particularly intriguing because of its name. It was called The Language of Mathematics. Now, I'd never thought of mathematics being a language, and here was me trying to understand all of these other sorts of languages. But as I read this book, I realised, oh yeah, no, this is a fantastic language. This is the language that nature uses to build the universe. It's the language to help us understand how the universe works. And not only that, it was a language that sort of appealed to my sense of wanting some logic to a language. There were no irregular verbs, for example. That's not to say there weren't interesting twists and turns in this language and surprises, but I love the fact that it all made logical sense. And as I began to read the book, understood that mathematics is nature's language. Nature uses mathematics in order to kind of structure the world. And in particular, the one interesting language I read about in this book was this language of symmetry. And it seems like nature really uses symmetry as a way of sort of communicating information. If you go into the garden, for example, and you see a bumblebee flying around, it has very bad vision, can't judge distances, but what it can pick out is shapes with symmetry, because it knows that's likely to be a flower, and the flower will have sustenance for the bee. The flower in its turn needs the bee to come and help it propagate its genetic heritage across to other flowers. So there's this kind of communication going on, which is using symmetry as the language to communicate between the bee and the flower. And it's said that the more symmetrical a flower, the sweeter the nectar inside the flower. We too, humans too, use symmetry as a way of communicating information. Here's two faces that I've made artificially symmetrical. Now, if I ask you, which of the two faces do you find more beautiful? The ones at the top or the ones at the bottom? Most people are drawn to the two at the bottom, which I've made artificially symmetrical. Because symmetry, again, in human faces is communicating information. It's hard to make symmetry. And so if you see somebody with a symmetrical face, that's a sign probably that they've got good DNA, good upbringing, are going to make a good partner to have children with. It's a sign of health. And so this is why we find symmetry something that we call beautiful in a human face. Again, symmetry communicating information. And I always like this quote of Galileo, who summed up the power of mathematics and symmetry to understand the universe around us. He wrote, "The universe cannot be read until we have learnt the characters, the language, and become familiar with the characters in which it is written. It is written in mathematical language, and the letters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without which means it is humanly impossible to comprehend a single word." So our journey of symmetry, where did it begin? In fact, humans have been trying to understand symmetry for many, many years. And on the second chapter of the book, September, I decided to go to the British Museum to understand, what were the first symmetrical objects that humans were kind of playing with. And it turned out that they were literally playing with them, because the first symmetrical objects turned out to be dice as part of a game. Now, I actually took my son along, and my son is sort of like a companion in this book, my passe-partout, as I journey around the world of symmetry. And he was a useful kind of innocent set of eyes to look at the world of symmetry as I made this journey through the book. I had this very sophisticated language that Every's Galwa had given me, and I was interested to see where he saw symmetry or where I saw symmetry where he didn't. But this game we discovered, the Royal Game of Or, has dice. It's a kind of early forerunner of backgammon. But the dice are not the usual dice that we play with in Monopoly, cube-shaped dice, but little tetrahedron, like this shape here. The tetrahedron is made up of 4 equilateral triangle faces. And what's interesting, of course, is if you throw a tetrahedron onto the table or onto the floor, a face doesn't show up, but a point. So actually the way you score with these tetrahedron is that 2 corners of the tetrahedron are coloured, and you throw a load of these tetrahedron on the floor, and then you count how many of the coloured pointy tips are pointing upwards, and that's your move in the game of Or. So these, if one wanted to make a dice which was fair, you needed symmetry, so no face was favoured over any other. So the playing of games started our kind of journey into wanting shapes with symmetry. But this game dates back 5,000 years, and there were other communities also exploring symmetry. In the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, we have these extraordinary Neolithic balls discovered in Scotland, which are like little footballs with patches on them, and you can see the artist sort of trying to understand how to put these patches on in a symmetrical manner, a bit like making a football out of pieces of leather. These balls are about the size of something that would fit in your hand quite nicely, and it's not quite clear what these balls were for. They don't seem to be part of a game. They may have been part of a useful fortune telling, but we're not too sure. But what we're seeing here is early humans exploring the possibilities of symmetry. This is a kind of artistic approach to symmetry, but we have to wait some time before we get a real mathematical, analytical approach to symmetry. And that happens with the ancient Greeks, who start to try and classify, well, what are the possible symmetrical shapes that would make good dice, for example. So we've seen the tetrahedron in the game of Or, the cube that we have in like a game of Monopoly. But of course, if you open up a box of Dungeons and Dragons, you'll find other shapes which make great dice. And so Euclid's elements, the culmination of Euclid's elements, is a proof that there are actually only 5 possible shapes where all the faces have the same shape and are put together in a symmetrical manner. So we have the tetrahedron, the cube. You can put 8 equilateral triangles together to make an octahedron. There's a way of putting 20 equilateral triangles together to make an icosahedron. And lastly, a beautiful shape, the dodecahedron, made out of 12 pentagonal faces. Plato believed that these were so fundamental and that symmetry was the building blocks of the universe, that he believed the particles of nature, the things that made up matter, were in fact symmetrical in shape. And so at the time, the ancient Greeks thought the atoms of matter were earth, wind, fire and water. And so Plato associates shapes with these different elements. So the tetrahedron, the spikiest of the shapes, is fire. The octahedron is air. Stable cube is earth. The icosahedron, which is the most spherical of all the symmetrical shapes, is water. And then he had this one left over, the dodecahedron with 5 pentagonal faces. And he believed this was the shape of the universe. At the time, of course, the ancient Greeks had a model of the universe that we were somehow trapped inside a great big glass ball on which the stars were painted. And so Plato believed that the shape of this glass encasement was a dodecahedron. Now, of course, we, from this modern scientific perspective, see this as a rather crazy way of seeing the building blocks of nature. But I think Plato was already onto something very deep here. That symmetry is at the heart of the way the universe is built. Today, we actually think, not that the universe is in some great big glass dodecahedron, but we do think the universe could be finite and sort of looped up in a way. And one of the shapes that we're considering is a dodecahedral shape, where you go out one face and enter through an opposite face. So intriguing that Plato was already perhaps onto something which is a modern model of the universe. But across the sciences, symmetry has always been important, and especially in our modern age. For example, in chemistry, the way crystals form will be symmetrical in nature, and you can understand the way a crystal behaves because of that symmetry. In biology, you don't really want to get a symmetrical object because they're generally viruses. The coronavirus, for example, has a symmetrical shape. Understanding that symmetry can help us to perhaps do something to prevent these viruses taking hold. Fundamental physics as well. The elementary particles that we're discovering in the Large Hadron Collider, a lot of the predictions have been made, and we've made sense of these particles as kind of faces on some strange symmetrical object in very high dimensions. And we can often predict a new particle because sort of one of the faces in this shape is kind of missing at the moment. So symmetry is incredibly important to fundamental science, but it's also important to the arts as well. You see a lot of artists interested in the idea of symmetry. But artists have a slightly more ambiguous relationship with symmetry. Here's Thomas Mann talking about symmetry in The Magic Mountain. He has his central character go out into a snowstorm later on in the book, and the snowflakes fall on the arm of the protagonist, and he describes these snowflakes. He said he shuddered at its perfect precision, found it deathly, the very marrow of death. And I think for many artists, symmetry is too constraining, it's too predictable, and they sort of want to break out of that. But there is one art form that I think really celebrates mathematics in particular and symmetry as a really useful language for creation, and that's music. And very famously, Bach used a lot of symmetry to create theme and variations, reflecting themes, rotating themes, and the Goldberg variations, I think you could really say as a song to symmetry. There's so much symmetry at work in this piece. The symmetry in this piece really starts, in some sense, with it being 30 variations. It starts with an aria, ends with an aria, the same aria. It's almost as if there's a circular structure in this piece where it begins and ends the same place, sort of joins it up. In fact, halfway through the 30 variations, the 16th variation is called an overture, which is like the beginning of a piece. So you're not even quite sure where the beginning or end of this circular piece is. Every third variation is a canon. Canons are those songs where half the class starts singing and then the other half sings the same thing but delayed in time. So every third variation is a canon, but Bach wasn't content with just simply the canons repeating themselves. So every subsequent canon, the second voice starts a note higher. So each new canon, the second voice gets higher and higher and higher, until the 8th canon, something rather magical happens because it's an octave higher, which is actually sounds like the same note. So again, you feel like the singer's got another circle inside it with these canons that they come full circle and sort of join up again. So you've got a kind of circle's worth of circles in there. So for me, when I hear the Goldberg variations, I really see a shape, hear a shape. The shape is a kind of circle's worth of circles, or what we mathematicians call a torus. And the rhythm structures in these canons as well has a lot of symmetry at work in making decisions about what the rhythm will look like. So the canons are either in 2 beats, 3 beats and 4 beats, and each beat is either divided up into quavers, triplets or semiquavers. And Bach goes through all the different combinations possible. So you could consider this a bit like a combination lock with 2 triangles, one keeping track of whether there are 2, 3 or 4 beats, and then the second triangle keeping track of how the beat is broken up. And it's as if Bach is trying all the combinations on this triangular combination lock. So there are 9 different possibilities, and each of the first 9 canons cover all of those possibilities. There's so much symmetry in this piece that by the end you think you know exactly what's going to happen. But what's interesting is the last movement, which should have been a canon and you should know exactly what happens, is called a quodlibet, or a musical joke. So Bach completely breaks the symmetry. But it's interesting because I think artists like setting up expectations, which they then break with these kind of surprises at the end. But it wouldn't have been a surprise without all the symmetry building up to that last movement. So that's often how symmetry is used, to set up expectations, which you then break. One of my other favourite composers is a Greek composer, Yannis Xenakis. We're actually celebrating his 100th anniversary this year. He wrote a very amazing piece for solo cello, whose kind of variations are based on the symmetries of another symmetrical object. I'm not going to tell you what it is. I want you to listen to the piece and see what symmetrical object is conjured up in your mind's eye by the following piece. So what symmetrical object were you hearing when you heard that piece? Well, that was in fact a cube, although I'm quite hard pushed even to hear a cube, even though I know it's hiding inside there. And perhaps it's a little unfair because you really need to hear the whole piece before you hear all of the symmetries of the cube playing their part in the composition. And I just made an animation just recently with an artist, Simon Russell, exploring how Xenakis is using the cube to structure this particular composition. Xenakis, as well as being a composer and a lover of mathematics, is also an architect. He worked with Le Corbusier. I think architecture, again, is somewhere where you see this mix of kind of the mathematics of symmetry and art. Right back to the pyramids, for example, great symmetrical objects in the desert outside Cairo, through to the modern day. This is La Geode in Paris. It's this beautiful sphere. In fact, it was the realization of a dream by the French revolutionaries in Galois' time, because they felt building a sphere represented the ideals of the revolution, égalité, no direction favoured over any other. But I think they'll be a little bit disappointed to find out that this sphere that was eventually built in the 20th century is in fact an IMAX cinema, not a particularly revolutionary concept. If you go to Israel, there are these amazing dodecahedral houses in Ramot, but I'm told these are really difficult to buy furniture for because nothing fits inside the buildings. So architecture and symmetry, very important. And in November, I made a trip out to Japan to work with a colleague there, Professor Kurokawa. And when he heard I was writing a book about symmetry, he said, "Oh, I must take you up to the Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples up in Nikko, where there's lots of symmetry on the walls there." And we took this photograph, and just shortly afterwards went through the archway at the top of the stairs, and there we saw these beautiful symmetrical designs on the columns. There are 8 columns, and 7 of them are all exactly the same, but the 8th one is turned upside down. And I said to Professor Kurokawa, wow, the architect must have been incredibly angry at the builders for putting this the wrong way round. And Professor Kurokawa said, no, actually this is a very deliberate act, that again, rather like the Bach, where Bach destroys the symmetry to reveal how much symmetry there was up to the end of the piece. The architects too in Japan would like to break the symmetry in one place. And he referred me to these wonderful Japanese essays in idleness from the 14th century, where the essayist writes, "In everything, uniformity is undesirable. Leaving something incomplete makes it interesting and gives one the feeling that there is room for growth. Even when building the imperial palace, they always leave one place unfinished." So this upside down column was in fact the unfinished place in the palace. But if I was going to choose one place to spend the rest of my life as a lover of symmetry, I would have to choose the Alhambra in Granada, because this palace is just a celebration of the power of symmetry. And in the October half term, I took my family off at the Alhambra to explore the symmetry. My family have got quite used to me taking these rather nerdy mathematical holidays, so this holiday was to explore the symmetry of the Alhambra. Here's a picture of my son not looking too happy at being dragged around having to find the maths in the palace. You can already see the symmetry at work. They love water, that's reflecting the building. The buildings have kind of left-right reflectional symmetry. But the really wonderful symmetrical games are going on the walls, where they have this wonderful tiles full of interesting symmetries, and they're exploring all the different ways that you can put tiles together to play these symmetrical games. And I was very interested to ask Tome, when he looked at some of these walls, whether they thought they were symmetrical. Because I think most people's idea of symmetry is about left-right reflectional symmetry, like in our face or in a building. And so, for example, the wall that you discover when you enter the Alhambra is the one in the middle on the left, and this design looks, you know, like there's no reflection or symmetry there at all. And so Thomas' first impression was, yeah, no, there's no symmetry here. But this is one of the revolutions that Galois made, that he began to think about symmetry in a very different way. So for him, symmetry, the way you can move these tiles such that when you put them back down again, they look like they did before they moved. So you see, if I move the tiles around that a central point in the 8-pointed star, all the tiles magically, after a 90-degree turn, sit back down on top of each other. And so what you're looking for a symmetry in a wall or these tiles or a particular shape are, what are the ways that I can move the shape such that when I put it back down again, it looks like it did before I moved it. So this is really Évariste Galois' kind of revolutionary new way of thinking about symmetry, that unlike Thomas Mann, who symmetry was a very deathly thing, it was about stillness. For Galois and for mathematicians post-Galois, symmetry is about movement. It's about how can I move an object such that it looks like it did before I moved it. So I sometimes like to call the symmetries of an object, for example, this tetrahedron, they're the magic trick moves. If I ask you to close your eyes and then I move this object and then you open it and it looks like it did before, the move that I made is a symmetry of this object. So you're interested in what are all the different moves that I can make of an object, and those are its symmetries. So for example, let's take a 6-pointed star with a slight twist on the arms and a triangle. What are the different moves that I can make of these two objects such that they look like they did before I moved them? So let's start with a 6-pointed star. Basically, there are rotations that you can do. You can do a fifth of a turn, so the yellow dot moves from A to B, or a third of a turn, or you could do half a turn, or you could do 2/3 of a turn, and finally 5/6 of a turn. So that's 5 rotations, but Galois added another rotation, which was just leaving the star where it is. So you lift it up and put it back down again. So you need to think of that a bit like the zeroth symmetry. 0 was a great breakthrough as a number that the Indians discovered. Many people thought, why do you need a number to count nothing? Numbers are accounting things. So for us too, in symmetry, we like to have a zeroth symmetry, which is just keeping the thing where it is. So we had 6 symmetries of the 6-pointed star. Notice you don't have a reflectional symmetry here because I put this little twist on the starfish. So what about the triangle? Well, here I can do a rotation of a third clockwise or a third anti-clockwise. But now I do have reflections. So I can reflect in the line through X, I can reflect in the line through Y, and I can reflect in the line through Z. So, and again, 5 different moves I can make of my triangle, and then the 6th one, which is just leaving the triangle where it is. So both of these shapes have 6 symmetries. So you might say, well, they've got the same symmetries. Well, they've got the same amount of symmetry, but there's a big difference in the symmetries of these two objects. And this is Galois' second breakthrough, that the important thing isn't just these individual symmetries, but how they interact with each other. Because if I do one symmetry followed by another, then the combined effect on the shape must be a third symmetry because it's ended up in a new position. So there must have been a move I could have done in one go. So there's actually a sort of algebraic relationship, a grammar that relates all of these symmetries together. And it's the way these symmetries interact, which is which helps us to tell the particular nature of the symmetry of these shapes. So we can think of the way these symmetries combine in a kind of table. So, for example, here's the symmetries of the 6-pointed starfish. So I've given the symmetries names. Capital A means the yellow dot stays at A. Capital B means it moves to little b on the shape. So each of the rotations has a particular name. And then I can ask, well, what's the combined effect of doing, say, like a 1/6 of a turn, so that's B, followed by a third of a turn, which is C. Well, if we combine these together, so we do a sixth of a turn followed by the third of a turn, well, the little yellow dot ends up at D, so that's the same as if I'd done a half a turn in one go. So this table helps you to see what happens if I combine two symmetries together, what's the combined effect. Now, for the symmetrical six-pointed star, if I change the order and do a third of a turn followed by a sixth of a turn, it doesn't really matter what order I do these in. The starfish still ends up doing a half a turn with the combined effect. But this is completely different in the triangle. So if I actually combine doing a third of a turn and then a reflection in the line through X, then that is the combined effect of that is as if I'd actually reflected just in one go in Z. But now do the reflection first in X and then do the third of a turn. Well, the combined effect now is as if I'd reflected in the line through Y. So in this shape, it matters what order I do the symmetries. And so this means that although these both have 6 symmetries, the way that they interact is very different. And it turns out that Galois was able to write down rules for when movements interacting like this must be the movements of a symmetrical shape. And using this language, group theory that he developed, he was able to prove, for example, there are only 2 distinctly different symmetrical shapes with 6 symmetries. And if you find another object with 6 symmetries, the way its symmetries interact will be either like the ones of the triangle or the six-pointed star. Now, this language allows us to go to the Alhambra and understand that 2 walls that might look very different, in fact, have the same underlying symmetries. So, for example, here are 2 walls in the Alhambra. So you're looking for places where you can move the tiles and they fall back down as they did before. So we can rotate them a sixth of a turn around the point where all of the kind of shimmering triangles meet, or a third of a turn in the center of one of these shimmering triangles. And then there's another quite hard place to find, which is halfway along an edge. If you rotate half a turn around these points, the tiles sit back down on top of each other. So you've got 3 different sorts of symmetries there. But if we change the wall and look at this rather strange wall with Z pieces and the 6-pointed stars, we find the same symmetries. A sixth of a turn around the center of the 6-pointed star, a third of a turn where the Z pieces meet, and then all the tiles will sit back down on top of each other, and then a half a turn, which is halfway between the 2 6-pointed stars. So although the geometry of these 2 walls looks very different, we can say their underlying symmetries are actually the same because the way the symmetries interact are exactly the same in both. In fact, we could put both walls on top of each other and any symmetry we made to one of the walls will also work on the other wall. Galois is almost making the same breakthrough in symmetry as we did when we first discovered the concept of number. There might be 3 people sitting on 3 chairs, but the number 3 is common to both of them, even though the people are very different from the chairs. So you need to think of Galois' breakthrough on symmetry in a similar way, that what he's done is to abstract the idea of symmetry underlying these shapes and ignoring the actual physical look of the shapes. So we can now start to talk about whether 2 walls have the same symmetry. So, for example, here are the entrance to the Alhambra, a wall and a floor in the same room. They all look very different. But the symmetries here are again the same. We call it 4-4-2, nothing to do with football, but because of the fact there are 2 places where you can do a quarter of a turn and 1 place half a turn. And so this gives us a way to start to say, well, you know, what's the limit here? The geometry is kind of unlimited what you can do, but the symmetry is actually limited. So it took till the end of the 19th century for mathematicians to understand Galois' breakthroughs and use it to prove that there are, in fact, in the Alhambra, only 17 different symmetrical games that you can play on the walls in the Alhambra. Any attempt to make an 18th symmetry you'll always find is actually the same as one of the symmetries of those first 17. So if you think about Escher, who actually made several trips to the Alhambra and was inspired by the Alhambra to do his amazing graphical work covering the page in Angels and Devils, for example, each of those, even though the pictures are different, will be the same as one of these 17 symmetries. So one of the games we played in the Alhambra was to go and see if we could discover, did the artists in the 14th century discover all 17 before the mathematicians in the end of the 19th century proved that that was all that was possible? They almost did. There was one wall where if the colours were slightly different, it would have been the last 17th symmetry. And I think Thomas and I were very tempted to colour in the blue tiles into black to make it the 17th symmetry, but we thought we'd be arrested if we did that, so we left it as it is. So this language has helped us to really understand how to classify symmetry. And we now, thanks to Galois's work, Galois showed that in fact symmetry is rather similar to chemistry in that there are basic building block symmetries from which all other symmetries are built, that you can make indivisible symmetries, a bit like the hydrogen and oxygen of the chemical world, that symmetry too has these basic building blocks. The simplest are, for example, the rotations of two-dimensional figure with a prime number of sides on it. A 15-sided figure can be, the rotations can be made out of the rotations of a triangle, 3-sided, and a pentagon, 5-sided. So any composite number of edges can be made out of these prime shapes. But it turns out that there are much more interesting indivisible symmetries as well. For example, the icosahedron or dodecahedron, its symmetries, there are 60 rotations of the icosahedron or dodecahedron. And 60 is a very divisible number, so you might think, well, that should be not an atomic symmetry. But the way the symmetries work in here, it's impossible to find a smaller symmetry which divides into it to make a symmetrical object. So this turned out to be one of the first interesting sort of non-prime number symmetries in the periodic table of symmetry. And since Galois's discovery of prime symmetries, things we call simple groups, we've been trying to put together the periodic table of symmetry. And in the 1980s, finally, a complete list was made of the symmetries that are the periodic table, the building blocks of all symmetries. And they were put together in this wonderful book, the Atlas of Finite Simple Groups, an enormous, great book. And this was done about the same time as I finished my studies in mathematics. And I was very keen to continue my investigations of symmetry. So I decided I was going to do research, my doctorate in symmetry. And this book had just come out, published by Mathematicians in Cambridge. So I decided to go up to Cambridge to talk to the group to see whether perhaps I could join their research to try and see what the next steps were in the language of symmetry. And I visited Cambridge, and I met the first author on the book, who was the main instigator of putting together this project of creating the Atlas. And he said, well, if you want to join our group, there are a few conditions. First of all, what is your name? And I said, Marcus du Sautoy. He said, oh, okay, well, you'll have to drop the do. I said, oh, that's really weird. Why? He said, well, all the authors of the Atlas, if you'll notice, they all have 6 letters in their name. Okay, well, Sautoy was okay. So if I drop the do, then I would actually fit the pattern. He said, okay, well, but there are a few more things. What are your initials? I said, MPF, du Sautoy. He said, okay, well, you're going to have to drop one of those because we only have 2 initials. Sure enough, the 5 authors each had 2 initials. So, okay, MP Sautoy. I thought, well, maybe I can drop the F. I said, no, that's not all. So John Conway was the first to have this idea, and he worked with his student at the time, Rob Curtis. And then another PhD student was kind of hanging around the office. Simon Norton seemed to be very good at understanding some of these incredible symmetrical objects in very high dimensions. So he joined the group. Then they needed somebody to be able to do some of the computational things. And Parker was enlisted. And then finally, Wilson joined the group as the fifth member. If you notice, they all joined in alphabetical order. So if I was going to be added to the group, I would have to change my name from Sautoy to Sautoy, MP Sautoy. At that point, I thought, this is too much. And so I decided to go back to Oxford and carry on my research there. But I was a little bit worried, you know, if finally we discovered all the building blocks for symmetry in this wonderful atlas, was there anything left to do? But it turns out, yes, there's still so much to do. Now we understand the building blocks. One of the great challenges is, how do you put these objects together to make new symmetries? What are the molecules you can make out of these atoms of symmetry? And so that's my own particular research, is trying to understand the symmetries you can make out of these building block symmetries. And it's led me to the discovery of new symmetries in very high dimensions, a little bit like trying to understand what are the dice in hyperspace, or how can you tile a kind of multi-dimensional Alhambra. And that's what my research is dedicated to. So I came to the end of this year working away on the challenges, the conjectures that I've been working on. And by the end of the year, I hadn't solved the problem I was hoping to solve. I'm still actually working on it many years later. But it made me realise that it's a complete myth about the fact that you finish your best work by the age of 40. You still, if there are unsolved problems, then there's still a passion every morning to get to your desk to try and answer those unsolved problems. And I always like to remember that quote that Professor Kurakawa gave me when we went to Nikko. He said, in everything, uniformity is undesirable. Leaving something incomplete makes it interesting and gives one the feeling that there is room for growth. And for me, it's all those unsolved problems of symmetry and of mathematics that makes mathematics a truly interesting subject and gets me up every morning to do my mathematics.